The forum, or warium, smelled of damp stone, livestock, and a faint trace of smoke rising from sacrificial fires. It was a bustling marketplace on most days, filled with the noise of cattle herders, merchants, and slaves hurrying between stalls. But on this day, in 2664 BC, the scene was transformed. A wooden platform had been hastily erected in a dusty corner of the forum, cordoned off not for trade, but for ritual. 3 pairs of men stood ready, armored and tense, waiting for the signal to begin. They were not soldiers defending the city. They were slaves, human property, ordered to fight to the death. Their combat was not for glory or victory, but to honor the memory of the deceased father of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever, a Roman noble. What unfolded here would later be remembered by the historian Livy as the first recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome. The Romans themselves called it a munus, a duty, an obligation paid not in coin or in words, but in blood for the family of the deceased. This grim spectacle carried weight beyond simple entertainment. To them, it was a sacred offering, a way to show devotion to their ancestor and appease the restless spirit of the dead. In Roman belief, death demanded repayment. The spilling of blood, the sight of sacrifice, was meant to sanctify the transition between life and the underworld. Yet even in its solemnity, the ritual carried a strange allure for the living. Onlookers crowded the edges of the makeshift arena, caught between reverence and fascination. What was meant as a duty to the dead was becoming a spectacle for the living. The men fought not only as substitutes for ancient human sacrifice, but also as unwilling performers in a drama that drew gasps, shouts, and wide-eyed awe. The Romans had not yet built amphitheaters, and no roaring Colosseum loomed over them, but already the seeds of something larger were taking root. The origins of this practice reached back further than Rome itself. In southern Italy, especially in Capua, and among the Samnites, peoples once bitter enemies of Rome, similar customs had long existed. At funerals, it was not uncommon for warrior duels to be staged, drawn from an older tradition of human sacrifice at tombs. Over generations, what had once been ritual killing slowly shifted into ritual combat. The emphasis moved away from the finality of death and toward the struggle itself. The duel became the performance. The act of fighting, not simply dying, became central. This transformation reflected a broader cultural change. The transition from blood as offering to blood as spectacle. In this moment, history tilted. The Romans, with their unmatched capacity for organization and ritual, would take this evolving practice and fold it into their own civic and political life. What began as a solemn family duty would soon become a public obsession, as the Christian writer Tertullian would later observe with horror. These combats were the spilling of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead. But even he noted how the rite no longer belonged to the tomb. It had slipped into the eyes and hearts of the living. From Campania to Rome, the ritual was no longer confined to mourning. It was shifting, becoming part of Rome's identity, destined to grow far beyond its original scope. The story of the gladiatorial games did not begin with the Colosseum, or even with emperors, but here in this muddy forum, with a handful of slaves forced to enact a sacred duty. Blood was first spilled to honor the dead, but the living could not look away. Most people only know the Colosseum, but if you stop here, you'll never see how Rome invented blood as politics. Don't let history's silence win. Stay. The duels that began as funeral rites could not remain private for long. In Rome, almost nothing sacred escaped the grasp of politics. As decades passed, the solemn humora staged for fallen nobles began to draw wider audiences. People came not only to honor the dead, but to watch, to marvel, to feel the thrill of lives hanging in the balance. The spectacle was contagious. What began as a family's sacred duty slowly became a community's public event, and in a city where power was inseparable from performance, leaders quickly recognized the value of blood on display. By the 3rd century BC, these combats began to drift from tombs into festivals. Rome already had its ludi public games originally dedicated to the gods. The most famous were the Ludi Romani, held in honor of Jupiter himself, king of the gods, often during times of crisis or thanksgiving. At first, the games were chariot races, theatrical plays, or athletic contests, but soon, the duels that had once belonged to funerals were invited into these festivals, becoming part of Rome's official calendar. What had been a duty to the dead was now a spectacle for the gods, and by extension, for the people. The shift was subtle, almost invisible at first, yet it was a turning point. The blood that once consecrated tombs was now consecrating the state. The Senate's hand in this evolution was decisive. Whenever famine struck, or when war threatened, or when omens darkened the skies, the Senate would vote to fund more ludi. These games were no longer a family's private burden. They were a civic duty, financed by public funds. Religion provided the excuse, but politics provided the motive. The games became a tool, a way for the Senate to reassure the people that the gods were appeased, and that Rome's fortunes were secure. And for ambitious magistrates, especially the aediles, who organized the games, the spectacles became stepping stones to power. The larger, grander, bloodier the show, the greater the applause, and the stronger the memory of the official who had given it. In Rome, popularity was currency, and blood was its price. The transformation was not only spiritual or political, it was physical. At first, temporary wooden arenas were constructed in forums and open fields, improvised spaces that echoed the funerary origins of the duels. But as the appetite grew, Rome built in stone. Amphitheaters began to rise across the Republic, first in the provinces, then in the city itself. These structures were not mere buildings. They were monuments to a new form of lawmaking, a new language of state power. Inside their circular walls, order was established, hierarchy displayed, and Rome's authority made visible. The people gathered not to mourn, but to be entertained, and to be reminded of the state's supremacy. And so, with every drop of blood spilled in the sand, Rome was writing law, not in ink, not on tablets, but in sand and stone. The funerary duel had become a political instrument, and politics had found its most enduring stage. If you click away now, you're letting Rome's propaganda triumph all over again. Don't give them that victory. The iron gate groaned open, and a hush fell over the crowd. From the darkness of the arena tunnel, a man stepped barefoot into the sand. His tunic clung to his skin, torn and thin, his only weapon, a short, dull blade. Across the arena, another gate rattled open. A lion emerged, ribs pressing against its fur, its eyes glinting with hunger, sharpened by days of deliberate starvation. The crowd leaned forward, holding its breath. This was not a duel. This was not a fair fight. It was an execution, man pitted against beast, for the entertainment of thousands. By the 1st century CE, the Roman games had grown beyond the contests of gladiators. They had become theaters of nature itself, twisted into ritual. These spectacles took two forms. When trained hunters entered the arena to slay wild animals, the event was called a venecia. A hunt, exotic creatures were imported from every corner of the empire. Lions from Africa, leopards from Asia Minor, bears from the forests of Europe. Their presence was not just for danger, but for wonder, to remind Romans of the vastness of their dominion. But when condemned men, criminals, prisoners of war, rebellious slaves were thrown defenseless against those same creatures, it became something darker. Damnatio, bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Here execution was staged as spectacle, and punishment was made indistinguishable from entertainment. The roots of these performances reached back to the late Republic, when ambitious generals began to recognize the political power of the arena. Pompey the Great staged some of the most elaborate beast hunts in Roman memory, filling arenas with creatures the people of Rome had never seen before. To the crowd, it was awe. To Pompey, it was propaganda. The message was unmistakable. If he could dominate nature itself, if he could command elephants, lions, and panthers, then surely he could command Rome. Every animal slain was not just a kill, it was a symbol, proof that Roman power was absolute, and that nature itself bowed to the Republic's might. Archaeology confirms the grim reality of these encounters. In Roman Britain, the bones of a man were uncovered, his pelvis scarred by deep bite marks that matched the jaw of a large feline. His story is not written in books, but in scars left on bone, evidence that he had faced his death in an arena, torn by a predator he could not possibly withstand. His remains are a silent testimony, proof that these were not legends or exaggerations. They were real, and they were brutal. Yet not all who faced the arena accepted their fate. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, recalled how some condemned men chose to end their lives before their appointed show, preferring suicide to the humiliation of dying as entertainment. Their refusal was an act of rebellion, silent, final, and unbroken by the roar of the crowd. Even stripped of freedom, they seized the last dignity left to them, the choice of how to meet death. This was not nature unleashed, it was nature enslaved. Hunger was sharpened into a weapon, animals turned into executioners, men turned into prey, all so that Rome could applaud. Rome wanted their deaths to be forgotten. If you don't share this story, you're letting the roar of lions fade into silence. Keep it alive. The air trembled with the pounding of drums. Horns blared across a shimmering basin where sunlight rippled on water, not calm but ominous, because this was no harbor, no sea. This was Rome's theater of war. Before the eyes of tens of thousands, fleets of ships drifted into formation. Slaves, prisoners, and condemned men clutched oars and weapons, their faces pale under the painted crests of helmets. The signal was given. Suddenly, water churned with the cars of rams, the splintering of wood, the screams of the drowning. The crowd roared. In Rome, war itself had become a performance, and the sea had been enslaved for spectacle. It began with Julius Caesar in 46 BC, ever the innovator of both politics and propaganda. To celebrate his victories and dazzle the people, he staged the first great Naumachiae, a mock naval battle, on an artificial lake near the Tiber. He filled it with real ships, manned by thousands of fighters, many of them condemned captives, who had no hope of return. The crowd gasped at the sight. Miniature fleets clashing, men falling overboard, swords flashing on the decks. For Caesar, it was not simply a game, it was a declaration. He alone commanded not just legions on land, but fleets on water, and even the waters themselves bent to his ambition. Augustus Caesar's heir carried the tradition further. He constructed an enormous basin, large enough for entire navies to maneuver. His Naumachiae was legendary, a spectacle Rome had never seen before. Tens of thousands of spectators lined the edges to watch Egyptian and Tyrian fleets reenact battles of myth and history. What was the cost? Thousands of men condemned to fight and drown in shallow water, while the crowd drank, cheered, and placed wagers. Rome was teaching its citizens a brutal lesson, that even the chaos of the seas could be mastered. repackaged and served as entertainment. Under Claudius, the scale grew monstrous. To impress the empire, he drained part of Lake Phorcine and staged a Naumachiae involving an estimated entire fleets battled across the surface of the lake, their cries echoing through the hills of Italy. And then, the most famous words of Rome's blood theater were spoken. Before launching into combat, the condemned are said to have saluted Claudius with the line, Ave Imperator, morituritas salutent. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. It was not a salute of loyalty, but of despair, an acknowledgement that their fates had already been sealed for Rome's amusement. Even the Colosseum itself, that monument of stone and shadow, became a stage for what? Under Emperor Domitian, the arena was engineered with a system of channels that allowed it to be flooded. Imagine, where gladiators usually fought lions, ships now floated. Naval battles erupted beneath the same arches that had witnessed sword duels and beast hunts. For the people of Rome, it was proof of their empire's godlike mastery. If men and beasts could bleed on command, so too could oceans obey. This was no celebration of seamanship. This was no training exercise. It was war stripped of meaning, repackaged as theater. Rome commanded not only men, but water itself. If you're watching this far, you see how Rome bent even nature to its will. Don't betray the condemned thousands by leaving their story untold. Hit like so, their deaths aren't erased. The Colosseum was not merely an arena. It was a stage where Rome's imagination fused with its appetite for cruelty, creating spectacles so bizarre they blurred the line between theater and execution. The poet Martial Law, who witnessed these games firsthand, describes scenes that sound like nightmares. Orpheus, the mythical musician, stood in the arena strumming his lyre as wild animals circled him. For a moment, the illusion held. The crowd hushed, enchanted by the story they had read in their myths. But then a bear, starved and unleashed, lunged and tore him apart. Orpheus did not charm the beasts. He died screaming, his blood soaking the sand. And it did not stop there. Another victim was forced to play the role of Daedalus, the great inventor of myth. He appeared with wings strapped to his arms, attempting to fly across the arena, but instead of escaping like the hero of legend, he was caught and torn apart, his wings shredded as the crowd howled with delight. Even Persephone, the queen who in myth mated with a bull, was grotesquely reenacted. A condemned woman was placed inside a contraption shaped like a wooden cow. From the tunnels beneath the arena, a real bull was released. What followed was not a myth brought to life. It was humiliation and slaughter made into theater. At times, fire itself became the weapon of spectacle. Rome perfected an execution method known as the tunica molesta, the troublesome tunic. Victims were dressed in garments soaked with pitch, tar, or resin, then set alight before the eyes of thousands. These human torches staggered across the arena, writhing in agony, their cries echoing against the stone. For the crowd, it was mythological theater. Heroes punished like Prometheus or Hercules. Only here the suffering was no allegory. It was real, and the flames devoured the condemned until nothing remained but ash and smoke. The Christian writer Tertullian, who lived in the 2nd century AD, left a bitter record of these horrors. "We are mocked," he wrote, "as kindling men." For him, the cruelty was not only physical but symbolic. The executions were meant to erase dignity, to reduce human beings to props in Rome's theater of domination. To the Roman people, it was spectacle. To the condemned, it was annihilation in the guise of art. This was not simply killing. This was mythology weaponized, stories rewritten in the medium of blood and fire. Rome transformed its cultural heritage into a playbook of torment, where imagination became an accessory to death. Each reenactment reminded the audience that no god, no hero, no myth could escape Rome's grasp. In the arena, every legend was rewritten to end, not in triumph, but in agony. Rome didn't just kill, it rewrote myths, in blood and fire. If you're horrified right now, remember, this was exactly Rome's goal, to make cruelty into theater. If you don't comment, you're letting their cruelty win again. Rome's arenas were more than sand, stone, and spectacle. They were laboratories of power, where the state experimented with death, until it became ritual. What began in 2064 BC as 3 pairs of slaves dueling at a funeral spiraled into an empire-wide industry of orchestrated brutality. First came the funeral duels, solemn duties to the dead that slowly morphed into a fascination with the act of killing itself. Then hunts and executions blurred punishment with entertainment, turning starved beasts and condemned men into instruments of political theater. Naval battles flooded basins and lakes, proving that Rome's control reached not only over men, but over nature itself. And finally, mythological tortures made death into a grotesque parody of legend, rewriting the stories of gods and heroes in blood and fire. Each stage in this progression reveals a chilling truth. Violence was never random. In Rome, it was curated, choreographed, and consumed. Every sword thrust, every lion's roar, every ship sinking into an artificial lake was designed not simply to entertain, but to reinforce the message that the state held absolute authority over life and death. The crowd's applause was more than noise. It was a form of consent, binding Roman citizens to the machinery of empire. Blood was not wasted. It was converted into loyalty, awe, and silence. That silence is perhaps the most haunting legacy. For centuries, thousands of men, women, and children met their end in these spectacles. Their names erased, their screams swallowed by stone. Only fragments remain. A scarred pelvis dug from the soil of Roman Britain, mosaics etched with the frozen terror of fighters, bitter words from Christian writers who saw their people burned alive in tunics of fire. These fragments speak louder than marble monuments. They remind us that Rome's greatness was built not just on aqueducts and roads, but on suffering carefully staged as celebration. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, confessed how these games changed him. I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among human beings. He wasn't describing barbarian tribes or enemy armies. He was describing his fellow Romans. The arena had the power to transform ordinary citizens into participants in cruelty, shaping not only their entertainment, but their morality. Rome measured its power by the choreography of death. The roar of the crowd was the empire's heartbeat, and every life extinguished in the sand, in the water, or in fire was another note in the symphony of statecraft. So now, the question turns to you. Which spectacle, funeral duels, bestial hunts, Naumachiae, or mythological tortures, best exposes Rome's control over life itself? Don't walk away without leaving your mark. If you stay silent, you're doing what Rome wanted, erasing the victims. Break the silence. Comment, like, subscribe, and share their story.